Let's begin by davening that the fruit of our learning should help to bring home the hostages and protect our soldiers, Am Yisrael, and all the innocents, and bring a speedy end to this war.
Amen.
So here's Paul. Oh, wonderful. Give him a second to connect. Let's see. There we go. Okay, Paul, you're with us? Oh,
When I got home and I entered the class, I fell asleep. fell asleep.
we were just talking about that because I said that I was preparing for Shir again this morning, and it was going well until about an hour ago. I got really tired. It's usually around this time that I take a nap. And it's one of the reasons I don't like being in Chutz La'aretz, but this is one of them. Middle of the day is the time I
now
take
you
a
have
nap.
no way to come back.
Well, I'll see. I think that, it changes from day to day. And it's funny because when I booked this flight, I was thinking that I should book on El Al because they're the least likely to cancel. Um, but I didn't. I booked on Delta because I'm getting, I don't know, because I'm getting status miles, and I thought, oh, it's okay. I got on the way in, so it was okay. But I know my uh, some of my kids are coming. My daughter came last week on, I think, one of the last flights that was coming out on Iberia. And my son and his girlfriend are also trying to come, and their flight on Iberia was canceled, and now they're rescheduled on British Airways, and we'll see if they get out or not. I don't know. I'm hoping that this will not be an issue when I want to come back next month, but I have a few weeks to worry about that. Anyway, Shem Yirachem. After a lot of consideration, I've decided this issue, so the issue that we started talking about based on the Gemara that we saw in Yoma is this idea of Tosefet Chol al Kodesh. And then we looked at the Ran last week. We did a kind of a cursory reading of the Ran, who asks a basic question: when exactly is this time of Tosefet? And he rules out Bein Hashmashot because Bein Hashmashot, he says, is a time when it's already Safek Karet. In other words, it's already a time when you might, if you do, let's say, Malacha on Erev Shabbat, Bein Hashmashot, you have a Safek of whether you're Chayav Karet or not. And we know from our Gemara that the Tosefet does not carry a punishment of Karet. So basically, it means that it have to be before Ben Hashmashot. But then this leads into the wider question about what do we mean by Ben Hashmashot? When exactly is that time? And when are these times? When is Shkia? When is Laila? When is Ben Hashmashot? And this is a very complex issue, which again we touched on somewhat in the Ran. And we did also a cursory reading of the Gemara in Shabbat. I think that was maybe 2 weeks ago, which serves as one of the most important sugyot in this regard. But there are other sugyot that we didn't look at. There's a sugyot Masech Pesachim, and there are various other sugyot, including actually the sugyot at the very beginning of Brachot, about Isha shekohanim nichasim b'chol b'trumatan, and there's a drasha there where it talks about Biyat Shemesh, Uvah HaShemesh V'taher, and what is Biyat Shemesh. Anyway, it's a big topic. Rav Yechiel Michal Kupchinsky, who you may have heard of, he was a Rav in Yerushalayim. Many Kihilot Ashkenaziot still use his luach, his daily luach, for determining the davening, and also he had a luach for the zmanim for every day. I used to actually buy.
Tikuchinsky?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I think it's Tokchinsky. Tokchinsky.
Mhm.
He wrote a couple of he wrote several important books. One of them is called Bein Hashmashot. It's a book that he wrote about this issue, which I started to go through this past week and see the way he summarizes these sugyot. So obviously we could do several shiurim on this issue. In fact, you could do like also a whole year-long course on this issue. It's a complicated issue. But what we're going to do instead, because I want to continue on mainly in the Gemara and Masechet Yoma, today we're going to look at least some of how the Aruch HaShulchan puts this together, because I find him very, his derech is very clear, and it's laid out well, and he will address most of in the time that we have, he'll address most of the sources that are relevant. So I think we'll start there, except I'll just say one thing, that in the beginning, at the Hakdama of Ben Hashmashot, Tokchinsky points out something interesting, which is that the start of the day, which we mark by Alot HaShachar and Zrichat HaChama, seems to be fairly straightforward. So Alot HaShachar is defined as when we see the first light in the morning on the horizon. And in Jerusalem, that's like roughly an hour, 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes before you'll see the sun, before you begin to see the sun. And then once you see the sun, that's Hanetza Chama. But when you get to the end of the day, it's somehow more controversial. So the simple definition of Shkia,
it should be symmetric, no?
What?
It should be symmetric.
It should, right. And this is what he points out. It should be symmetric. So what would it mean that it should be symmetric? The simplest way then of understanding it is Shkiat HaChama should be the time when you no longer see the sun on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
And then night should be when you no longer see any light on the horizon. So that would be the symmetrical way of looking at it. The reason it seems to get complicated is because we have various sources in the Gemara that refer to this end of the daytime, and they seem to use different measures. So let's dive into this and see how the Aruch HaShulchan puts this together. So he starts off with a Braita that we did not see. It's a Braita in the Mechilta. So this is the Aruch HaShulchan, Orach Chaim, Siman Resh Samech Aleph. So this is into Duchot Shabbat. Tanya b'Mechilta. So we learned in Braita in the Mechilta in Parshat Yitro, Zachor v'Shamor. Right. So in Parshat Yitro we have the Seret HaDibrot, and it says Zachor Yom Shabbat, and in Dvarim it says Shemor Yom Shabbat. So Zachor v'Shemor. So why is it Zachor v'Shemor? Zachor milfanav, u'Shmor me'acharav. Remember it from before and keep it after. Mikan amru mosifin mechol al hakodesh. So from here they said that we have to add from chol onto kodesh. And so what's the drasha? How do they get from this that you add from chol al kodesh?
So Zachor would mean, Zachor is here taken to mean adding beforehand, and Shemor is taken to be adding afterwards.
Right. So why would that be? Why would, in other words, what you're saying is correct, but why? Like, what? How do they darshan Zachor to mean adding and Shemor to be adding?
I always understood Shmor is has to do with the physical world, and Zachor has got to do with our mind. That's what I always understood. But
So
I
look,
don't see how this relates
How it- to Tosefet.
yeah.
So first of all, what you say, if there are a lot of drashot about Zachor v'Shemor. So, and I understand what you're saying because Zachor is something that we would means to remember, associate with our
It's
mind,
in our head. It's in our head.
right? And Shemor would be to keep, that is to to guard physically somehow.
Yes.
So,
What we do and not do, but we do something. We do also when we don't do, we do something.
right. It's also it's within the realm of action.
Action,
So
yes.
so of course we have drashot that fit into that as well because Shamor was understood to be by Chazal, was understood elsewhere by Chazal to mean lo taseh melacha. To keep Shabbat means to not do melacha. And Zachor means to remember it with Kiddush. Okay, so it's it's similar to what you're saying. It's basically that same idea. But here, I think we have to not that this will contradict it. I think we're going to take these concepts slightly differently, and we'll say Zachor, remember. So if you remember before and we keep after, so remembering before implies that you'll have to recall, right? You'll have to recall, that is in the sense of preparing yourself for Shabbat. You have to recall that has to be before Shabbat. So that implies that we're adding some amount of time before Shabbat so that we can recall that now it's going to be Shabbat. And Shamor, to keep, in its most literal sense, right, to guard, to conserve, means I'm going to keep Shabbat as long as it takes. So that implies that I maybe that implies that I have to keep it even after it's done to make sure that I kept it properly. Possibly. Anyway, this is
What's one other idea, maybe?
yeah.
I mean, it occurs to me like Shabbat, unlike Yom Tov, does not require any kind of declaration from Sanhedrin in order for it to be Shabbat. And so if it requires no declaration, then perhaps the same, but on the other hand, the Tosefet does require an act of will. So maybe in saying, like if Shabbat happens anyways, why do we need Shemor v'Zachor? I mean, unless we're going to take it to mean, as you say, Kiddush and all the other mitzvot around Shabbat. But if it doesn't require declaration, if it happens anyways, why do we need the commands Zachor v'Shamor. Well, it seems to be irrelevant. So therefore, this perhaps there we could take it to mean the Tosefet, which does require something like that.
Does require. I'm not.
It requires a human. The Tosefet requires a human intervention, unlike Shabbat itself. And so therefore we have therefore we have these two different.
Do you know what? If I think, let me say back to what I think you're saying. So you're saying, okay, so Shabbat is something that, as you say, it happens as it were as a natural cycle. It's something that was decreed by the Kadosh Baruch Hu that happens every week, regardless of us. We don't have any say in it. Zachor and Shamor are both commandments that are given to us in relation to Shabbat. So it's going to tell us something about something that we have to do in our relationship to this Shabbat, which is a fixed thing. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, so you might be saying that would be at least serve as a basis for saying that maybe that would imply that we have to add on something beyond which the divine has fixed, something like that.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
What's that?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, no, it's an interesting idea, which I hadn't thought of it before at all. I'm not, and I think it fits into this idea of the Tosefet. I'm not sure that it's exactly what it's saying. However, I think what you're pointing out is a really interesting point in general, that because Shabbat was decreed by, decreed by God, we don't establish Shabbat. So what is our relationship to Shabbat? Is Lizkor v'lishmor. So anyway, okay, I'm going to leave it at that. It's a very interesting concept. I'm glad you brought it up. Let's go on. In any event, so the Mechilta says this is the Zachor v'Shemor gives me the basis for adding Mechol al Kodesh. Mashal l'ze'ev. This is a very interesting analogy. It's analogous to a wolf. Shehu toref milfanav u'milacharav. Ad kan l'shono. It's like a wolf that tears right at its prey, both in the front and in its back. V'hachi perusho. This is how we understand it. The derech hazaev sheino horega behema beemtza haguf. It's not the way of the wolf to kill the animal that it's attacking in the middle of its body. Ela o milfaneh, rather either in the front, in other words, bitzavara, in its neck, goes through the neck, o milachareh, or it goes through its behind. Ukeshem shazaev horeg kol haguf b'torfo milfaneha o milachareh. And just like the wolf kills the entire animal by tearing it either from the front or from the back, kmochen im lo yosif mechol al hakodesh milfanea umilachareh, harei zeh kemechalel kol hashabbat. So, by way of analogy, if you don't add on from Chol to Kodesh, both in the beginning and at the end, it's as if you have violated, profaned all of Shabbat. So it's an interesting analogy. I'm just going to leave it at that. Lefikach, nonetheless. Therefore, Hisira Torah al zeh. Torah warned us about this. In this way, we say in the Medrash Rabbah, Basar v'dam, flesh and blood, right? People, she'eno yodea lo itav v'lo riga'av, hu mosif mechol al kodesh. In other words, we as mere mortals, we don't know our times and our minutes. In other words, we can't calculate. We can't calculate precisely every time. So we add from Chol onto Kodesh. So that implies that the Tosefet Chol al Kodesh is a result of our inability to accurately calculate Shabbat, or our inability, I shouldn't say to calculate, but to determine. And so this is something that we've touched on before, that, and one could argue about this also for the beginning of the day as well as the end of the day. That is to say, when exactly night comes, when exactly the difference is between the day and the night, is not something that is clear to us, right? We saw in the Gemara in Shabbat, Rabbi Yossi says that um, uh, says that Ben Mashot is keheref ayin. It's like the blink of an eye. Ze yotzei v'zeh nichnas v'yefshar lamod alav. That Shabbos comes in and Chol goes out, and you can't determine that exact moment. In other words, only God can determine the exact moment. And it's part of it's part of our experience, So we could point to something. We can point to, let's say, when the sun is out, we'll say that's day, and when it's completely dark at night, we'll say that's night. But we know that there's this period of time when it's not completely light and it's not completely dark, right? And this is what we're going to discuss.
Shel,
Yeah.
I already suggested it. He understands this Tosefet as a kind of gader, to be on the safe side.
Yeah. We'll get to that. So what we saw when we talked
but
about.
you said, probably, I think it makes much sense, that it is not a gader because it also has a very precise moment when it starts. If it were a gader, it could be some time, I don't know, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, something, but not. This Tosefet starts at a very precise moment, so it's not really a gader to be on the safe side, because you could say, I want to be on the safe side for the Tosefet also. You could do that also.
So here's the thing. I think what we saw so far, and we pointed out that the Rambam and also the Tur actually don't hold that there's a mitzvah of Tosefet at all, except for Inui on Yom Kippur. And that's one of the reasons we're having trouble understanding exactly what the Tosefet is. So everything that you're speaking about, this, we will get to this. So what one of the questions is what's the Tosefet there for? And what does that have to do with determination of Shabbat and so forth? Let's see. Let's go on. So he says, "V'yoma linyan tosefet Yom Kippurim amrinan minayin v'gam Shabbat v'yom tov or v'yomim tovim tzarich tosefet michol al hakodesh." So this is our Gemara, right? So the Gemara says, from where do we learn after learning about tosefet for Yom Kippurim? The Gemara says, what's the basis for saying that we have to add on to Shabbat and Yom Tov? Talmud Lamar, Tishbetu Shabbatchem. Right, so he's being the Katzer, right? He's just taking out most of the drasha, but we learn it from those two words. Tishbetu is for Shabbat, Shabbatchem is for Yom Tov. Halamarata dechol makom shnemar shvot, komar shvita, mosifin michol kodesh. Right, so that's what the Gemara says. Any place where the Torah says shvot, to stop, to restrain yourself from doing malacha, it teaches us you have to add on from full to kodesh. He brings up in brackets here Gemara Moed Katan, which is one of the sources that's relevant, but I'm going to skip the brackets so that we don't have to go into that sugya. Sif bet v'zeu shekatav Rabbeinu ben Yosef b'sif bet yesh omrim shetzarich losif mechol al hakodesh ayin sham. Right, so let's take a second, just look at the the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch says, this is Sif Aleph. Safek Hashecha, Hu Bein Hashmashot, right? So when we're in doubt as to this period when the day gets dark, and that's what we call Bein Hashmashot. And then the Ramah says, V'hainu Kedei Shiur Hiluch Gimel Reva'ei Mil Char Shkiat HaChama. So he says, what's this Shiur Bein Hashmashot? It's the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a meal after Shkiat HaChama, after the sun goes down. We are going to revisit all of these things, but for the moment we'll just take it as we see it. So V'shiur meal u'shlish sha'a pachot chelek shloshim. So how much is a meal? In other words, the shiur of a meal, it's a shiur of time. It means it's the time it takes for an average person to walk one meal. So how much is that? The shiur meal is 1/3 of an hour minus 1/30 of an hour, which would be 2 minutes. So it's 18 minutes. That's the shiur meal. So Kedei shiur hiluch gimel.
Hours, not zmaniot.
So exactly. So for this is a measure of minutes that we use. In other words, it's going to be in a 60-minute hour, it'll be 18 minutes. So Bein Hashmashot is defined as the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a meal. So that's going to be 13.5 minutes. 3/4 of 18 is 13.5. Okay, and we will revisit the math. The math so far, it's not that complicated. It can get more complicated, but we're going to keep it simple. So that's Bein Hashmashot. So that is to say, Achar Shkiat HaChama. So taking the simple definition of Shkiat HaChama, which is the time that you no longer see the sun on the horizon, then you would count 13.5 minutes. That's Bein Hashmashot. So during that time, Ein ma'asrim et avadai, ve'ein matbilin et hakelim, ve'ein madlikin et hanerot, ve'ein marvin eruvei tchumim. So, right, you should know all this. This is from the Mishnah in Bameh Madlikin. So during this time, in other words, we're not allowed to do anything that would be vadai malacha. Because why? Because we said Bein Hashmashot is a time of safek karet. It means that we don't know now if we're in Shabbat or we're in Chol. And there are 3 sfekot about Bein Hashmashot. One is it's safek yom. In other words, it could be that it's entirely day. One is safek laila. It's actually entirely night. And safek yom v'laila. It could be that it's a mixture of the two, or at any given moment, it could go from day to night. And there are different opinions about what that means as well. But for the moment, so we understand, though, because of this safek, this is a time that if you do malacha, you're chayav karet. So these things that are listed, ein masrin et avadai, ein mapilin et hakelin, ein madlikin et hanerot, ve'en marvin eruvei tchumin. So we know what these things mean. Masrin et avadai. I mean, I assume that we know what these means. What does it mean you can't take maser from a vadai, from something that's certain? What does that imply? Certain about what? What's the vadai?
It's certain that it wasn't meistered already.
Right. So in other words, what we also call tevel, right? So you're not allowed to take maser from something that you know for certain has not had maser taken from it already. We're not allowed to be tovel kelim. We're not allowed to light candles. and we're not allowed to make an eruv tchum. So why do we list these particular things? Because it could have just said you're not allowed to do malacha. What's particular about these things?
These are all things that we do preparing for Shabbat specifically.
Right. So these are things that we're likely to be doing on the eve of Shabbat, prepare for Shabbat. We want to maser, our food so that we can eat it on Shabbat. Shabbat is kovea l'maaser, which means that if you didn't, if you harvested crops of any sort, fruit or grain or anything, once they're different, there are different things that are kovea, meaning that determine at what point you have to take trumot and masrot in order to be able to eat it. So let's say if you're out in the field and you pick an apple off the tree, you don't have to take maser for that. If you gather it up, then at a certain point it will be considered to be trying to think of the words, but whatever, it's considered to be harvested and ready for for your use. And at that point, you're going to have to take trumot and masrot. So the different things that are kovea for trumot and masrot. One is if you bring it into your house. Once you bring crops into your house, you have to take trumot and masrot. Literally, it's if you bring them through your door, you have to take trumot and masrot. But the other thing is, if you pick things before Shabbat, and then Shabbat comes, Shabbat is also kovat. Shabbat also says that any crops that you've picked, now you have to take trumot and masrot from them in order to eat them. And you can't take the trumot and masrot on Shabbat. Okay, I'm digressing. Ein matbilinat kelim, so we understand that. If you have clean new kli that was made by a non-Jew, you're supposed to topple it before you use it. So why wouldn't you be allowed to do that on Shabbat?
Because before it's tunneled, you can't use it, and so you're creating. I don't know if it's creating a new vessel, but you're making it useful where it wasn't useful before.
Yeah, so it's considered to be a tikkun. It's like you're fixing it, and that comes under the category of makebet atish, right, which is one of the melachot. But so that's why you can't tavel kelim. You can't light candles for obvious reasons because you're not allowed to light fire on Shabbat. Ein marvin eruv tchumin. Can't make an eruv tchum. That's a little more complicated. I'm going to leave that, but it's in contrast, as we see, to eruv chatzerot. The reason eruv tchumin is a problem in particular is because, according to a lot of opinions, eruv tchum is an eruv that has a basis midioraita. It's a tikkun dioraita. It's a tikkun that we learn from the Torah itself. We learned it out, according to some opinions, from Lo Yitzei Ish Mimkomo B'Yom HaShabbat. Right? So anyway, that's an Eruvin issue. But by contrast, about Masrinet at Demai, you are during this time of Ben Hashmashot, you're allowed to take Maser from Demai. What's Demai?
Produce where it's uncertain whether it's been whether it's been meistered or not, whether master's been taken or not.
Right. So demai, basically, yes. Demai is when you get produce from an am haaretz, that is from a person that we're not sure if they took maaser or not. And according to Chazal, actually, at the time when this was an issue, they determined that most amei haaretz did take maaser, but because of the minority who didn't, they said that you have to take maser again. So it's a safek whether you have to take the maser. So again, taking maser, which we didn't, okay, what's the problem with taking maser on Shabbat? Because it's also a tikkun. You're also making something that was not fit for use on Shabbat, you're now making it fit for use on Shabbat. And so you're not allowed to be Maser Vadai, but you can be Maser Demai, because it's a safek whether it needs it or not. The Tomnim et Chamin, we can cover up hot pots that we want to, use eat from on Shabbat. Marvin Eruvei Chatzerot. We can make an Eruv Chatzer during that time, during Ben Hashmashot. Mutar lomar le'eno Yehudi. You're allowed to say to a non-Jew Ben Hashmashot, v'hadlik ner l'tzorech Shabbat. You can say directly to a non-Jew during Ben Hashmashot. You don't have to do this thing of like hinting to them and so forth. You can just say to the non-Jew to light a candle for that you would need for Shabbat. V'chein lomar lo sod kol melacha shehi l'tzorech mitzvah o shehu tarud v'nechpaz aleh. You can tell him to do any malacha that's for the purpose of a mitzvah, or that you were too preoccupied or too rushed to be able to do it. Haga. This is the Ramah. V'chein misha kibel alav Shabbat sha'a shtayim kodem chashecha. Somebody who took upon themselves Shabbos 1 or 2 hours before dark. That is, even if you bin Furash took on Shabbos early, until it gets dark, you're allowed to say directly to a non-Jew to do things, to do malachot for you during that period of time. Okay, so this is Seif Aleph. So what do we see in Seif Aleph of the Shulchan Aruch? That during that Ben Hashmashot is a time of safek karet. In other words, a safek that already we're not sure now if it's Shabbat or not. So we are limited in what we're allowed to do. But since it's not Vadai Shabbat, there's certain things we're still allowed to do. And how is Ben Hashmashot being defined? It's being defined as from the time of sundown plus 13 and a half minutes. That's how we've defined it so far. Now let's look at Seif Bet. Seif Bet says, Yesh Omrim, there are those who say, Shetzarich lahosif mechol al hakodesh. So now we introduce this idea that you have to add on from chol to kodesh. So right away we understand Ben Hashmashot is not a time of Tosefet. What we're going to talk about now is adding on more than Ben Hashmashot. So apropos of what Paul brought up a few minutes ago, Ben Hashmashot is the time that we stop doing Vadai Melacha because of Safek, because we're not sure whether we're going to be over on Shabbat or not. So Sefet is going to be a time before that. So some people say you have to add on Mechol al HaKodesh. Zman Tosefet Zeh. So what is the time for this Tosefet? Mitchilat Hashkiya She'en Hashemesh Nireit al Haaretz Ad Zman Bein Hashmashot. So some people say, what is this time? It's the time of the beginning of sundown, when the sun is no longer seen on the land, and it's on the horizon, until the time of Ben Hashmashot. So we see that we're already introducing a different opinion, because in Seif Aleph we said, from the time of Shkia, we add on 13 and a half minutes, and that begins Ben Hashmashot. So this is from the beginning of Shkia, Ad Zman Ben Hashmashot. So what is that? Bazman hazeh shu gimel milin v'reviyah. This time between the time of Shkia till the time of Ben Hashmashot is the time it takes to walk 3 1/4 mil. So how long did we say it took to walk a mil?
13 and a half minutes.
And
The,
that
the
was
three, the, The 3/4 of it.
The 3/4. So one meal was 18 minutes,
18.
right? So 3 1/4 meal is how long? Could do the math. So it'll be, right, 54 minutes, and 1/4 of a meal is 4.5 minutes. So it's 58.5 minutes. So it's a long time. So it's from the time that of sundown, you would add 58.5 minutes. Ratzala Soto. So this is the time of Tosefet. Ratzala Soto Kulo Tosefet Oseh. If you wanted to make that entire time Tosefet of Shabbat, you can do it. Ratzala Sot Mimenu Miktzat. If you want to just do part of it as a Tosefet, Oseh. You do that. ובלבד שיוסיף איזה זמן שיהיה ודאי יום מכל al HaKodesh. As long as you add a time that's definitely day from the week onto Kodesh, onto Shabbat. V'shiur zman. Well, let's just read a little bit more. V'shiur zman bein hashmashot. The time, the actual time for bein hashmashot, hu gimel reviyei meal. That bein hashmashot is 3/4 of a meal. Shei mahalach elef v'taf kuf amot. It's the time it takes to walk 1,500 amot. Kodem halayla. Right, one meal is 2,000 amot. 3/4 of a meal is 1,500 amot. It's the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a meal before nightfall. Haggah. The Rama adds, so if somebody wants to add from Shabbat to start from Plaga Mincha, then you can do that. So that's considered to be the earliest time that you can start Shabbat per se is from Plaga Mincha. When is Plaga Mincha?
On the Luach, I don't know where it comes from.
How do you determine Plaga Mincha? I think we've talked about it before, but maybe somebody knows or somebody remembers. No. Yes.
All these calculations, they depend on your latitude. And
Of course. But how you?
Where did he live?
Well, when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he was living in Tzfat.
Yes.
Okay, but no. But the point is, the formula is always the same. The formula is going to be when is Plaga Mincha? You start from Mincha Gdola. When is Mincha Gdola? It's 6.5. Michael Schwartz.
It's the earliest time that you could say mincha, but I don't remember the exact number.
Okay, so let's go over this. The early here, hold on a second. We learned this, and I think we've looked at this before, but it's okay. Let's do a little review. I don't think we're going to get through all of this today, but we're going to try to lay down a basis. We learned these times from here. So this is Masechet Pesachim. This is talking about the order of Michael Ward. Are you still with us? Not exactly. Okay. Tamid nishchat bishmono mechza v'karei b'tisha mechza ba'arvei Pesachim nishchat b'sheva mechza v'karei b'shmono mechza ben b'chol ben b'shabbat chal erev Pesach yod be'erev Shabbat nishchat b'shesh u'mechza v'karei b'sheva u'mechza v'pesach acharav. So that what we learned from here is the earliest time that you can bring the Korban Tamid is at 6.5 hours of the day, and that would be Shod Zmaniyot. In other words, however you take the light hours of the day, you divide them into 12, so you go 6 hours, and then you add a half an hour. In parentheses, I think we've also mentioned, there's a machloket poskim about what you consider the light hours of the day. And one shita is to say you start from Amud HaShachar, and you count all of the time until Tzeta Kochavim. And another approach is to start from Hanetzach Hama, and you go till Shkiat HaChama. So there isn't, that's like when you look on your luchot and it says like Shitat HaGra, and this Shita, and that Shita, the Magena, and so forth. That's based on those different calculations. But leaving that aside, however we calculate the day, 6.5 hours of the day, that's the earliest that we can bring the Korban Tamid. That's Yotzemi said that the earliest time we can daven in the afternoon is 6.5 hours. And that time is called Mincha Gdola, right? Because it's the most time. You start at the earliest possible time. It gives you the Zman Gadol, right? To daven Mincha. And it's learned out from here. But what we also see from here, that on a normal day, Tamid nishchat b'shvona mechza v'karei b'teshu mechza. That on a normal day, the Korban Tamid was shechted at 8.5 hours a day, and was actually brought at 9.5 hours a day of the day. And we know it took about. We learned in Masechet Tamid and Masechet Yoma, there was quite a lot to do from the time you shechted until the time you could actually bring it onto the mizbeach. So it's another hour. So that was on a normal day, and that would be normally considered the latest time. So that time would be called 9.5 hours of the day. That's Mincha Ktana. So it's not the latest time that you can daven. It's not even technically the latest time you can bring the Korban Tamid, but it was the latest time that the Korban Tamid was brought, and that's considered to be many poskim hold that's actually the best time of the day to daven because it's in correspondence to when the Korban Tamid was brought. Okay, so that's 9.5 hours of the day. Flag HaMincha, which literally means half or splitting of the Mincha, that's halfway between 9.5 hours and the end of the day, which would be 12 hours. So it's 10 and 3/4 hours. 9.5 hours take 9.5 hours plus 2.5 hours. That's the span of time between Mincha Ktana till Seita Kochavim. 2.5 hours. So half of that is 1.25 hour. 9.5 hours plus 1.25 hour is 10 3/4 hours.
So it's after Mincha Ktana. It's even later
Right.
than Mincha Ktana.
It's right. It's exactly this halfway time from Mincha Ktana, halfway to Chashecha, halfway to the end of the day. So it's 10 3/4 hours. That's the definition of Plag HaMincha. We were in the Shulchan. Oh yeah, okay. So that's me. All right. So Plag HaMincha.
After Plag Mincha, you can't daven anymore. Mincha. That's what it
No.
means?
So I'm clarifying. You can still daven Mincha, but what it tells me, Mincha Ktana tells me the ideal time to daven Mincha. That's the best time because it's in correspondence to when the Korban Tamid was brought in the Beit HaMikdash. But you can still daven. How late you can daven, this is actually part of this discussion. Can you daven all the way up until Chashecha, or can you only daven until Ben Hashmashot? This is a machloket poskim, and we will touch on it eventually. We'll come back to that. How late one can
on
daven
Kabbalat Shabbat, usually you, well, the mincha is samuch lekabbalat Shabbat, so it's rather late.
Hold that thought. It's what we'll see eventually is that the Aruch HaShulchan was a big advocate of starting Shabbat early, and he was not happy with people who started Shabbat so close to Shabbat. So, but let's leave that question aside for a moment, and we will come back to it. All right, so let's look at how the Aruch HaShulchan understands what we just read in the Shulchan Aruch. And he says, Zeu shekatav Rabbeinu Beis Yosef b'sif bet. This is what the Beis Yosef, in other words, the Shulchan Aruch, wrote in Sif Bet, Yesh Omrim shetzarich losif mechol aha kodesh. Some people say you have to add on from chol to kodesh. Ayin sham, look there. The Katav Lashon Yesh Omrim. He wrote this in the name of those. There are those who say. In other words, he didn't make it a psak, a hard fast psak that you have to be mosif chol kodesh. Why? Mishum the Harambam v'Atur lo hiskiru zeh rak b'tosefet Yom Kippurim linyan inui bilvad. Right, as we mentioned. So he's saying yesh omrim, you have to be mosif chol kodesh for Shabbos, knowing that the Rambam and the Tur didn't hold that you have to be mosif chol kodesh for Shabbat, and they only held you needed tosefet for inui of Yom Kippurim. Kamosha kadvu behelchot Yom Kippurim. Right? And this question of whether you mosif just for Yom Kippurim or for Shabbat, that's dependent on the sugya in Yoma, which is our sugya. And we saw that different parts of the sugya indicate different things. Mihu, nonetheless, Rov Rabotenu, most of our rabbis, Habahag, the Baal Halachot Gedolot, Arif, Arash, Basmag, the Yereim, the Sefer Yereim, the Haran, the Magid Mishneh, Pasku, all of these other Rishonim, Paskin, Diyesh Min HaTorah, Tosefet Shabbat V'Yom Tov. They all held that Midioraita, you have to be Mosif Mechol Al Kodesh, also for Shabbos and Yom Tov, Medina, right, as a matter of halacha. Nearly, Amnam, I'm not reading that right. Amnam Ledina nearly, the Ein Nafkamina. He says, as far as I can see, there's no real practical difference between these shitot. The Hazel Pshita, Shemuchrach Lafsik Mimlacha Kodem Shkia Ma'at. It's obvious that you have to stop doing melacha before sundown, at least a little bit. Right. So one of the things the Medrash said when he quoted earlier the second Medrash, he said that we can't determine precisely when the day ends. So since we don't know precisely, everybody would have agreed that you have to stop doing melacha before. But I think this touches on what Paul said earlier, which is you can say that there's going to be one of two reasons for this Tosefet. Well, either the Tosefet is what he's implying now, you have to stop early because you're not sure when the day begins. And so out of safek and out of fear of, being Bechalel Shabbat, you stop earlier. But the other idea of Tosefet, which we learned from the Breita and the Gemara, is that there's Ki'ilu Mitzvat Aseh, to stop doing work before. Not because you're in doubt, but because it's something that one should do, is to add Chol Al Kodesh. So he doesn't get into that here, but I just want to point that out. But he's saying, so saying practically there's not going to really be a difference in principle between whether you think Tosefet Chol Kodesh is Midioraita or not, because everybody is going to say you have to stop before Shkia at least a little bit, because otherwise you won't, you might be over.
Question.
Yeah.
Especially in Europe, where you are much quite
More north.
North, yes. The communities they can make Kabbalat Shabbat very very early. I mean, it can be 3 hours, 4 hours before Shkia. Is this time considered as Tosefet?
Yeah, it'll be considered as Tosefet. Yeah.
So the
And by-
dinim of all that, it can be very long this time. Then.
Yes,
If you are
it
in
can be.
Norway, the Shkia will
No,
be at 11:30, or maybe there
I
will.
think I told you one time I was Shabbat in the Lake District in England, which is not even the most northern, but it's very far north.
Yeah.
And Shabbat began, I think it was around 10 o'clock, maybe after 10.
Yeah, in
Shabbat
Luxembourg, it
was
can
out
be
after 11.
almost 11 o'clock in the evening. Which is not very very north. Yes.
Right. So, by the way, he's going to mention this later on when we're and I see we're not going to get to it all today, but I do want to go through the first few seifim of this siman. He's going to say, and a little bit later on, that these times of like the determination that how long Ben Hashmashot is, he's going to say these determinations were made based on times in Israel and maybe in Bavel. And he says, but he lived in Russia. He said, here in the north, some of these times are going to be much shorter. And he talks about that. And he actually, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, by the time of the Aruch HaShulchan, there were already printed timetables telling you when Shabbat began, when the kind of tables that we have now were already in use. And he says you can look at your watch, or maybe your neighbor has a watch. He calls, we saw this before. He calls a watch. I think he calls it a moresh sha'ot, right? Something that tells you
not
the
an
time.
orlogin.
Not what?
Orlogin.
No, I don't know that.
In French, horloge is
Right. But maybe the French post scheme at that time is that's what they would say, I guess, right? Because there wasn't yet an established word in Hebrew for it. So I think he calls it a moresh sha'ot, a time teller, basically. In any event, let's stick on track here, because all of these things hopefully we'll cover. So he's saying, okay, there's not going to really be a practical difference between those who say there's Tosefet Midioraita and those who don't say Tosefet Midioraita, because it's in any event you have to stop. Everybody's going to say you have to stop doing work, you have to stop doing melacha before Shkiat HaChama, because that's safek. It's a safek whether or not you know exactly when Shkia is. En koch biyad basar v'dam kamamar hamidrash shevein. V'yachar hashkia, after sundown, matchil ben hashmashot. After sundown begins ben hashmashot, shu safek skila, and that time is safek skila. Losem melacha b'shnei hashmashot, meaning b'shnei ben hashmashot, be'erev Shabbat u'motzei Shabbat, bizman echad, miman hashach mechuyav chatan. This is something we saw in the Gemara. The Gemara says, if you do malacha during Ben Hashmashot, so then that's a safek karet, so you would bring a korban hasham talui. But if you did malacha on Erev Shabbat, Ben Hashmashot, and on Motzei Shabbat, or toward the end of Shabbat, Ben Hashmashot, in other words, at the same time, then you bring up Korban Chatat, because in Manavshach, you did Malacha on Shabbat. One of Ben Hashmashot, we don't know exactly, but it's that if you did it at the same time, both, with 24 hours apart, Ben Hashmashot, then one of them was Shabbat and one of them was Chol, for sure. So you bring a Korban Chatan. V'chein pasak Rabba b'perek chamishi ayin sham. This is how the Rabba pasks. V'im kain, if this is so, kevan shemafsik mimelacha kodem shkia, once you stop doing melacha before shkia, hare yesh kan tosefet. Once you stop doing any melacha before shkia, that is a tosefet. Gamken sharei ein shiur lahatosefet, because there is no measure of this tosefet. Amnam be'etzem zman bein hashmashot yesh machloket bein poskim. Right, regarding the specific time of bein hashmashot, this is the subject of a machloket between poskim. D'chfi ha'mevuar me'akmara, habizman ben hashmashot meshech hiluch gimel reva'ei mil achar hashkiya. Based on what we saw in the Gemara in Shabbos, when is ben hashmashot? It's the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a meal after shkiya. So that would be the 13.5 minutes after Shkia. Afterwards, it would be night. According to the way we calculate that the time it takes to walk a meal is 18 parts of 60 in an hour, in other words, 18 minutes. Havyin Gimel Chalakim, so 3/4 of that time would be Yud Gimel Chalakim B'Chetzi. It'll be 13.5 minutes, right? That's the calculation we made earlier. So, based on this Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, if I take it Kipshuto, from the time I no longer see the sun on the horizon, I count 13.5 minutes. 13.5 minutes is Ben Hashmashot, and that's Safek Yom Safek Laila. And then right after the 13.5 minutes, it's nighttime, and it's Badai Shabbat. Amru b'Gemara. Right now, Od Amru b'Gemara. They further said in the Gemara, Kochav Echad Yom, Shnaim Ben Hashmashot, Shosha Laila, V'lo Kochavim Gedolim Hanirim B'Yom, V'lo Ktanim Hanirim B'Laila, Ela Beinonim. Right, so the Gemara also brings this siman for determining day and night. That, what does it say? One star, if you see one star in the sky, that's day. If you see 2 stars, it's Ben Hashmashot. If you see 3 stars, it's night. And the stars we're talking about are not big stars that you can see during the day, and they're not little stars that you can see only at night, but in between stars. Ayen Sham. Now, let's dissect this a little bit. B'zeh lashon HaRambam b'perek chamishi din daled. He says, the Rambam says as follows: Misha tishka hachama ad shiyiru gimel kochavim beinoniyim hu hazman hanikra ben hashmashot b'chol makom. The Rambam says, so from the time the sun goes down till you can see 3 average-sized stars, middle-sized stars, that time is called Ben Hashmashot in every place. Uhu safek min hayom, safek min halayla, right? It's a safek day and night. V'danin bo lahachmir, and we're dan lahachmir during that time. V'kochavim elu lo gdolim, lo gdolim lo ktanim lo binami. Right. So here's the thing. Before we go on, he's going to now analyze. We have two standards for determining these times. So according to the first standard, Ben Hashmashot begins with the sun going down on the horizon, and it lasts for 13 and a half minutes. According to another standard, it's from the time you start to, from the time you see two stars would be Ben Hashmashot. One star is still day, two stars is Ben Hashmashot, and three stars is night. And they're particular kinds of stars, and we're going to talk more about the stars in a moment. But now the Rambam says, so what does he say? He says, he just defines Ben Hashmashot as from the time the sun goes down until you see three stars. He leaves out this question of Gimel Riva Bil and so forth. The Aruch HaShulchan says, "V'dvarav einam muvanim." Right? What the Rambam says is not understandable. Sharei Igmara Amru Kochav Echad Yom. So we don't understand exactly what the Rambam means because the Gemara says when you can see one star, it's still day. And what can we say about that? About Korcha, perforce te'ino mina kochavim hanirim beyom. That star, the one star that says it's still day, that must not be a star that you could normally see during the day. Shaharei mefaresh achar kach v'lo kochavim gedolim hanirim beyom. Right? It says one star, two star, three stars. And it says the stars that we're talking about are not stars that are big that you can see during the day. So now we have to understand when the Gemara also said one star is still day, so that's one of these medium-sized stars that you would not have seen during the day, but the Gemara is telling you, nonetheless, even though you couldn't see this star when it was fully day, but this star, it's still day. See what I'm saying? Okay. About Korchach, the Abenonim
Those big stars are planets.
well,
It's
no,
Venus, yes.
no, no. It also
They didn't know that. They didn't know that. But
no. They did. They knew Venus. They knew the differentiate between the plant, because Venus you can see with your naked eye, and they knew
Yes.
the Chazal knew what Venus was. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but they're talking about certain stars, and depending on where you are in the world and what time of the year it is, there's some stars that are still bright enough that you can see them not in the middle of the day, but when it's starting to get dark, you can start to see stars.
Mhm.
And the very small stars, what that would mean, I learned this actually from my son, who taught himself quite a lot of astronomy, but maybe you all know this. When you look at the night sky, hopefully without too much light pollution, so sometimes you can see a star, but if you just look at any given point in the sky and you look at it continuously, you will start to see stars after a few seconds or even after a few minutes, because you're actually waiting for that light to hit you, as it were, right? So you don't see them immediately. Part of it is your eye is adjusting to the night. Part of it is being right to adjusting to see that little bit of light on the night sky. In any event, what he's saying here is there's certain stars that are so bright you can see them while it's still day. What would that mean for our purposes? You can see them even before the sun has gone down. before the sun has gone down, that's still day. Once the sun has gone down, even though there's still quite a lot of light on the horizon, if you can see a star during that time that's a medium-sized star, meaning it's a star that you apparently could not have seen a few minutes before while it was day. You would have to wait for there to be less light on the horizon for you to see such a star. That would be a Benoni. So let's go back. He's saying what the Rambam says doesn't seem to make sense because the Gemara says if you see one star, it's still day, and that star that the Gemara is talking about must not be a star that you would normally see during the day, meaning before Shkia, because it says afterwards that the stars that we're talking about are Benoniim, right? They're not stars that you can see during the day. So the chidush of that first star is that when you can see that first star after Shkiat Chama, even though that's a star you couldn't have seen during the day as such, it's still daytime, right? One star, it's still day. V'dain Yom Ve'ech Pasak. So how did the Rambam paskin Shemei Hashkiya Havi Ben Hashmashot? How can the Rambam say that Shkia begins at Ben Hashmashot, right? The Rambam said that Misha Tishka HaChama Ad Shiru Shlosha Kochavim. Rambam says Ben Hashmashot is from the time the sun goes down until you see three stars. And what the Aruch HaShulchan is saying is, but what we see from the Gemara is that Ben Hashmashot doesn't begin immediately at Shkia. It begins only from the time you can see two stars. Only from the time you can see two stars after Shkiat HaChama. So there's going to be some amount of time after Shkiat HaChama while it's still day. So how does the Rambam paskin that Ben Hashmashot begins with Shkia itself? That's his question. Do you understand the question? Michael Schwartz, what's the question?
So the Rambam is saying we can't have the Ben Ishmael doesn't start at Shkia because you can still see that you only see that single star. You need to see more stars before Ben Ishmael starts.
The Rambam says Ben Hashmashos begins at Shkia.
Which contradicts what's one of the explanations in the Gemara that says it doesn't start until you see that second star.
Right. So there's some amount of time between the time you see, from the time of Shkia, and then you can see one star until you see a second star. Ben Hashmashos begins with the second star. So how does the Rambam say that Ben Hashmashos begins at Shkia? That's his question. Ech pasak shemei Shkia havi Ben Hashmashot. Ukvar tamahu alav bazeh. People have already wondered about this, about the Rambam. Specifically, he refers to the Ralbach, Levi ibn Chaviv, who wrote an extensive perush on the Rambam's Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh. Va'od, moreover, lama hishmid hach the gimel reva'ei mil. Why did he altogether leave out the standard of the the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a meal, right? He doesn't use that standard at all. So we have two questions. Why does he say that Ben Hashmashos begins at Shkia? Because based on what we learned in the Gemara, it begins after Shkia. And why doesn't he introduce this standard of figuring out when that is based on the time it takes to walk a meal? Ve'ein lomar de plige, and you can't say that these two sources in the Gemara argue with one another. In other words, you might say, the Rambam held that those were two different sources in the Gemara. They were at odds with each other, and he paskin like the one that goes that the standard is going to be 3 stars at night, which means that I would start from Shki. He says you can't say that, right? Because we see the Rif himself brings both of these ma'amarim, and we don't have any reason. The implications, we don't have any reason to believe that the Rambam would have disagreed with the Rif on this, because unless we know otherwise, unless it's clear otherwise, the Rambam, as I've mentioned many times, the Rambam almost never disagrees with the Rif. Almost never. Shmamina the pligi. So I understand that it's implied from the Rif that these two sources in the Gemara are not at odds with each other. So he wants to answer the Rambam. Maybe the Rambam wrote this purposely. Mishum the ze nimsar rabim v'lanashim ve'amei haaretz miha yodea l'chavein shiurei midot gimel revei mil hafrish ben kochavim gedolim ketanim beinonim. In other words, he's saying that this whole thing of determining when Shabbos begins is given over, to everybody, not just Talmidei Chachamim, but it's given over to the masses and to women and to ignorant people, and who knows how to determine these measures of 3/4 of a meal, or to distinguish between big stars and little stars and medium-sized stars. In other words, the Rambam understood that he had to paskin in a way that average people are going to be able to follow this halacha without any great expertise. Lachain, nakit milta de psika. He took a cut and dried thing. Behind the shkiyat chama hakol makirim b'zeh. So he starts with sundown. Everybody can see that. Any fool can see when the sun goes down from the horizon. So he just said that's when Ben Hashmashot begins. In other words, he did it. In a sense, he's being machmir, but he did it in order that any person will know when to begin Ben Hashmashot. And from that time, you're not allowed to do melacha. And then the 3 stars, that's certainly nighttime. V'nafkamina, what's the practical difference? Let's say, in other words, in terms of Shabbos, what he's saying is, look, according to the Rambam, I'm going to start Shabbos no later than Shkiyat HaChama. So what difference does it make when nightfall is? So he says, "Nafkamina lemishi yotzel likrot kriyat shema b'layla." Right? It's still you have to know when to say kriyat shema. Oh, kiddush. There's some people who don't want to do kiddush until it's definitely Shabbat. Uchiyotze b'zeh. In other words, for these other things, but not for keeping Shabbat per se. Va'af shelo kulam b'ki'im ba'kochavim. Even though not everybody, there's that you'll say, look, everybody can recognize Shkiyat HaChama, but you're worried about these people who don't know how to do these calculations. But how do they know when 3 stars are at night? That also takes a little expertise. He says not everybody is so expert in that. Mikom makom, ein michshol bazeh. But there's no stumbling block with that. In other words, since according to the Rambam, everybody will stop doing melacha at Shkia, so even if they don't know precisely when Shabbos begins or when it's Vadai Shabbat, doesn't matter because they won't be violating Shabbat. Nam, of course, then you'll have to ask the question: what about on Motzei Shabbos? Because on Motzei Shabbos, it's going to be important when 3 stars come out, in order not to violate Shabbos on its way out. Badata kochavim habeinonim l'li litot v'agdolim. Right? You have to know the difference between the medium-sized stars, not to make a mistake and consider them as the large stars, because the large stars that you see will still be seen while it's during the day. So there is some amount of expertise that's going to be required for determining when Motzei Shabbat starts. Yerushalmi Perek de Brachot, Yerushalmi in the first chapter of Brachot, this is on the sugya, and Yerushalmi is on the sugya of the first Mishnah about Mishash Kohanim Nichnasim and so forth. Ita, in the Gemara there in Yerushalmi, it says the Shalosh Kochavim Tzrichim Liyot Mekubatzim Lo Mefuzarim. It gives us one other piece of information, that the three stars that you see to determine when it's Motzei Shabbos, or the end of the day, or more specifically when it's nighttime, they have to be close together and not scattered in different parts of the sky. V'zeh lashon haYerushalmi. This is the Yerushalmi says, "Uvilvad sheyidchamyan plata kochavim v'damyan kechad kochavta." It means as long as the yidchamyan that you can see or that is seen, three stars that appear to be like one star. Three stars that are so close together that at first glance maybe you think they're one star, but you can distinguish them three stars that are close together. That's the Yerushalmi. So that means that's a sign that even average people could understand, and you should be careful if you're determining Shabbat based on the stars, to wait until you can see three stars that are close together in the sky.
Shel.
Yes.
Rambam was living in Cordoba, later in North Africa, and usually you see the sky. But if you are living in Russia, you don't see the sky. You have it's clouded. You have lots of clouds.
He'll talk.
Right.
He'll talk about that later. And of course, we know famously, if you live in London, or if you live in parts of, like in also like in northern, upper state New York.
Oh, okay.
I'm laughing. I had gone for a tour of Cornell University in upper state New York, and people told me there that it's cloudy and raining most of the time, to the extent that professors would call off class when the sun came out, to give people a chance to enjoy the sun. In any event, yes, we know that there are lots of places in the world where it's cloudy most of the time, and he'll talk about that. And actually, one of the things that he'll say is a very modern thing that now we have tables and we have clocks, and we can rely on that. But nonetheless, it's important for us to know how to do these things. It's getting late. Just a second. I want to try to finish. I'm sorry to go on. I didn't want to go on this long, but I want to finish this next seif, because while this is still fresh in our mind about what he said about the Rambam. So he says, "V'nei l'shitata Rambam techef achar hashkiya matchil ben hashmashot." All right, so we've established, according to the Rambam, Ben Hashmashot begins right after sunset. Zohi shitata Rif Gaonim. This is also the shita of the Rif and the Gaonim. Amnam Rabotenu Baalei HaTosfot katvu b'shem Rabbeinu Tam shita acheret. Rabbeinu Tam had a different shita. Shita acheret b'zeh. Lozeh hiskimu gam haRamban v'haRashba v'haRosh b'Ta'anit v'haran b'Sof Perek Sheni d'Shabbat. Mishum dekasha lahu b'Rabotenu ele de'ech efshar lomar shemishi hishkia ad halayla lo havi rak gimur ve'enil how can we say? In other words, they're going to be bothered. Rabbeinu Tam was bothered by what is an apparent contradiction between the Gemara and Shabbat that we've quoted, which says that after Shkiat Chama, you take the time to walk three quarters of a meal, and then it's night. But I have a different Gemara, Masech Psachim. It says the Shkia ad halayla havi arba milin. From the time the sun goes down until nighttime is 4 milin. Time it takes to walk 4 milin, 8,000 amot. It's more than 4 times as long. So how do we reconcile those two Gemaras? V'chein piresh Rabbeinu Tam. So that's why the Rabbeinu Tam said, Sheshnei shkiyot het. Achat hatchalat hashkiya. Mimena yesh arba milin ad layl. So one of them is from the beginning of Shkia, and from the beginning of Shkia, there's the time that takes to walk 4 milin until the night. Shabbat ma'irinan mishkia shniya. In Shabbat, meaning in Masechet Shabbat, where it says Gimel Reva'ei Mil, that's talking about the second Shkia. So what's the second Shkia? V'hainu shekvar chama mishukat b'rakia. It's from the time that the sun is already completely set on the horizon. El shadayin lo avra achorei hakippah. It has not gone completely down behind the kippah, which at least the horizon. The siman lezeh, yeah, right, would be not completely down behind the horizon because it looks like a kippah. The siman lezeh, the sign for this is shepnei rakia ma'adimin keneged mikoma, that the what you see in the distance in the horizon is reddish. It's giving off like a reddish color in correspondence to its place. V'lechein mitchilat hashkiya ad gimel milin v'revia, from the time of the beginning of the sun going down, the time it takes to walk 3 milin and a quarter, adayin hu yom, that's still daytime. V'hu l'tosefet Shabbat. So what's the significance of that time? That's the time that you can add on for Tosefet Shabbat. U'meyaz matchil ben hashmashot. Afterwards begins ben hashmashot, and that's uv'gimel revei mil achar kach havi alayla. That's the 3 quarters of a meal. That's ben hashmashot before nighttime. We're going to pick up on this next time and flesh it out a little bit more. And yeah.
Again, if you are living in Israel, it takes a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, for the sun to
right. So we
but
have
if you are living in the north of France, where did Rabbeinu Tam live? Then it can take a whole hour.
So here's the thing: we're going to Beli Neder. I'm going to try to hook these up with some astronomical facts and exactly what was Rabbeinu Tam referring to, and how does that correspond to our astronomical understanding? And by the way, for those of you who are interested, there's a good Wikipedia article called Sunset. It talks about astronomy. If you read the Hebrew Wikipedia article on Shkiat Chama, if you can do the Hebrew, it's actually a very good article. I haven't read the whole thing, but I read a lot of it because there in the Hebrew article, they talk about the differences between astronomical sunset and halachic sunset. And that's what we're trying to determine now And it's a good reference. It's a good place to look, at least as far as I can tell. So Bezrat Hashem, we'll meet you next week. In the meantime, have a good night, and I have a good Saharayim. Bye bye.
Thank you, good night.
Night,
יישר
bye-bye.
כוח, תודה. ביי.